Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We have discussed drone strikes in the past, a number of times, in fact, on this show. And obviously, each time we discuss that from a human rights perspective, as far as the drone strikes that have taken place in many countries around the world, be it Somalia, Yemen, even here in Pakistan for a number of years as well as then the civilian casualties, or what may, in some people's eyes, be called collateral damage. Drones have always been spoken of as being very accurate when it comes to hitting their targets, but it's not always the case, seemingly, especially then when we discuss of that phrase, collateral damage and the civilian casualties at the end of such strikes. There is a new report and a new letter, in fact, that's come out by more than 113 organizations from around the world that has specified to Joe Biden, the new U.S. president, that he must end unlawful drone strikes outside of active war zones, A. And then B, it talks about another aspect of drone strikes, which we don't talk about a lot, and that is the racial aspect of this, saying that this has a lot to do with issues of racial justice, because of the receiving end. Then we have, for a large part, Muslim, brown, and black communities in multiple countries that are then largely affected by these drone strikes that the U.S. Carries out around the world. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Zahid Bukhari, who is the Executive Director of the ISNA Council for Social Justice. He's joining us this morning from Frederick, Maryland. Joining us from Columbus, Ohio, is John Quigley, who's a Professor Emeritus of Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University. And joining us from here in Lahore is Sikander, Shah, who is a Professor of International Law at Lum's University. Sikander, John, and Zahid, thank you to all three of you for taking your time out to join us today. Zahid, I'd like to start with you, if I may. I know that you are your organization is one of them who signed on to this letter, I believe. Firstly, tell us about why you felt strongly about signing on to this letter and what you hope this will achieve.
Thank you very much, Waqar, and the Indus TV. This the letter. I think we signed it if we signed it, but I think I have two reservations on that letter too. But still, we support this letter, and we appreciate this letter because they are making connection with the racial justice and also human rights in the foreign, and the importance of human rights in the American foreign policy. One is that making exception for traditional combat zones, war zones. Means who declared that these are the legitimate attacks in Iraq? For example, when the whole discussion was, and it was very obvious when America went there, it was total lie. The Colin Powell speech was a lie in the UN, and the whole weapons of mass destruction, all those theories were total fabricated. So declaring that this is a traditional and legitimate combat zone, I think I have reservation on that issue, that this is not good to making that exception. Number two, just making concentration on drone, that is good. It is good if it is a first drop of the rain, because there is a need. Although this September, 20 years of global war on terror will be completing. Right. I think there is a time. This is a time to re-examine the whole global war on terror. What we lost, what we learned. Because the whole global war on terror, this is a big subject, and our organization, with the help of some other organization, we like to put a full campaign on that issue. So that is needed, because not only drone, but the whole global war, it was an idea that need to be rethink, re-examined in the America for the betterment of America. Because just one point, because these 20 years when America was involved in global war on terror, exactly these 20 or 25 years when China was developing so much that now American policymakers just woke up and they thought, oh my God, China developed, we have to contain that. Yeah. So I think that that cost analysis we have to make, and there is one project in Brown University, Cost of War, and I think I will invite you some other time, have a program on that project. They are examining this whole war.
So if I could just come aside, I really, really appreciate the points you made there. And John, I wanted to get your thoughts on some of those points as well. Do you think that this is bigger than drone strikes? Of course, I wanted to get your thoughts about the letter as well, because drone strikes, they strike one as extremely disconnected from the realities of war on the ground then, right? So you have somebody essentially with a joystick sitting very, very far from the actual zone where you're hitting, war zone be it or otherwise. And there just seems to be a disconnect. Not to say that obviously soldiers on the ground is any better if it's an unjust war anyways, but just in that context of things, this seems like something that should possibly be limited.
Yes, I think that's the essential problem with drone strikes, is that it is not really known exactly who is being affected by them. I mean, when a soldier shoots a rifle in combat, one knows more or less where the harm is going to be inflicted. And with drone strikes, you simply don't know. I mean, I think that the United States targeters do take some care. At the same time, there have been some horrible mistakes where persons have been killed at weddings and other events that had nothing to do with the person that was being targeted. So, I mean, one possibility would be that the international community should conclude a treaty to ban drone strikes at all, even in combat situations. But they are most pernicious in non-combat situations because there one has no idea that one is going to be the target of this, and there's no way to protect oneself. When one is in a combat zone, at least one knows that there's a possibility that someone is going to be shooting.
Indeed. Sikander, I know you've done a lot of research on drone strikes in the past as well. I wanted to get your thoughts about this and the framing of this letter, which I found, again, interesting, beyond just obviously the call to stop strikes in non-combat zones, is that of the racial injustice aspect of this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you for the question. The thing with drone strikes is that, as the other speakers have pointed out, it comes with a host of problems, not just like social, legal problems, but also the fact that there's an absence of law. Most of the world right now has accepted drone strikes as a weapon. Which is problematic in the first place, because including me, a lot of academics feel that just using drones in itself is a violation of international law. How you use them is a separate question, and I think the world's really divided on that front. I think it's good to have this movement towards domestically and internationally about banning usage of drones and having civil society talk about them from a domestic. It's highly problematic in a human rights context, in a times of peace context, because under times of peace, no usage of force for extrajudicial killing is legal. Unless it's absolutely necessary as a law enforcement mechanism, which is, and domestically there is no space for that. I mean, I think space for the legal framework to allow killing. It's like a soldier or a policeman going and killing someone in their home without giving them the process of the law. And the problem with drones is that it doesn't. It's an extreme measure, really, because you don't have foots on ground. Then really you cannot injure someone and then follow up. You just have to either kill or not kill. And that leads to this extreme decision making, where you have, as you were pointing out, Waqar, that people are, this distancing involved. And it's not just geographical distancing, it's like social distancing, it's cultural distancing. Someone sitting in a first world country deciding how to use drones. There's an issue of accountability, because how do you hold these people accountable? Because do we know the combatants? Because it's very, it's someone who could be an intelligence officer who's not part of the military. And as you pointed out, this is a very special, interesting point and crucial point, that when you start using them, it invariably affects vulnerable communities, because you have a conflict or no conflict or disorder or terrorism in situations in places where there's low development, where there are ethnic minorities, where there are women and children who would be, because of the fact that how do you distinguish between combatant and non-combatant, and you're looking at tribal communities, and so there the impact invariably is not going to have in the American context also. They are used in a peacetime environment. It will be in an area which is socially deprived, and it will be the African American community, and in Muslim countries, and so what ends up happening is that even within countries which are minority, which are like South Asian or Middle East countries, you end up targeting communities that are minorities or underprivileged within those communities. Like you don't see drone strikes in Lahore and Karachi, you see drone strikes in the previously known federally administered areas of Pakistan, and
that's a very interesting point, Sikander. Zahid, I wanted to bring you back in, and I wanted to ask you, is there, or how much of racial justice is a part of the psyche of those who then, do you think, are okay with carrying out these drone strikes halfway across the world, right? Because one would imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that if, God forbid, drones were being flown above America's skies, and drones were attacking American cities and American people, that would be a very different reaction, right? I mean, I would imagine that the first world or the developed world would not like to have the same treatment that these other places are facing.
Yeah, but you are absolutely right. But what I'm saying, that it is not only attached with drone. This is the mentality. The drone will come after. That is the manifestation of that mentality. For them, if any civilian loss or millions of civilian loss, that is collateral damage. And for Albright, if there are hundreds of thousands children are deprived in Iraq, that is the necessity of war. I think that mentality of racial injustice, I think that also manifested in the drone strikes. But it is not only a drone that we just concentrate on that. I understand that with all those issues, but it is basically the whole war mentality, I think the philosophy behind this global war on terror, when they thought that this is their enemy, the green color is enemy, and then attack Iraq, and whatever loss is going on, civilian loss and vulnerable community loss, everything is okay. So I think that is the same manifestation is coming out from the drones. But I think behind the whole thing is that the mentality and philosophy behind this global war on terror.
John, I wonder what your thoughts are on this, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, I wonder, what are your thoughts about this aspect of racial justice? Again, no one would want any American cities or any developed country to be attacked by drones either, and especially innocents to be killed. But do you think if the roles were reversed, that the reaction would be very different, and then there would be a call to limit these? Is it because this is happening to developing countries that in some senses, for some people, it's arguably okay?
No, I think that's a very important point. I think it would be much more difficult politically for the United States to be carrying out drone strikes if they were doing it, let us say, in Europe, and the collateral damage affected, ordinary people in European countries. I think it's very interesting that the letter that has just been issued focuses on the racial, ethnic aspect and is connecting drone strikes now with the overuse of force that has been an issue in the United States in particular over the past year.
Sikander, what can be done, and I think we've spoken about this in the past, but what can be done vis-a-vis international law, and how does one rein this in when it comes to referring to international law? I mean, we know the United Nations obviously many of the times has its hands tied because of the way the UNSC is simply designed, to the veto powers of many of these superpowers that we have around the world. But nevertheless, what exists right now, do you think, that may be an instrument to be able to handle this situation?
Before I answer that, just to point out regarding your earlier question,
Sure.
You see, the thing with drone strikes is that they are being used by foreign nations in third world countries, or what they see as, in the continuation of their war on terror. In the case of America, no, I don't think at any point the Americans would allow any foreign forces without their consent to use drones or any other force on their territory. That would be seen as an act of war. That would be seen as something extraordinary. And so also in an American context, this is prohibited, in the sense that there are exceptions, however, but it's prohibited to use armed force. Law enforcement cannot intermix with military action. There's an act in the U.S. that prevents U.S. Military to engage in any law enforcement. As I said, there are exceptions in counterterrorism and these kind of situations. So these developed countries have also prevented such actions, have prevented from such kind of military use to ever happen unless they change their laws. Regarding international law, of course, there's a robust framework on, use of force. Article 51 of the UN Charter prevents any foreign nation from attacking. If they attack, you can respond in self-defense. The violation of it's linked to Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which talks about sovereignty and territorial and sovereignty and political independence. And then also you have various laws in law of war and international humanitarian law which don't specifically prevent drone strikes, but they have certain conditions like the proportionality of use of force, the unnecessary suffering caused, the issue of distinction. You have distinction between combatant and non-combatants, and the military necessity of using of force. And in all of these cases, when you apply them to drone strikes, they don't really fulfill the requirements of drone strikes, because they invariably drone strike don't distinguish, they are not proportional, they cause unnecessary suffering, and they aren't actually militarily required, because you always have options to engage, to enter into agreements with other countries, or to use ground forces. The problem with ground forces, however, is it's relatively more expensive for a belligerent force which is using drone strike. Drone strikes are relatively cheap, and there's no collateral damage for the aggressor. So these are the issues. International law is very clear at this point in time. At least my understanding is that how they are used is generally in violation of international law. Whether they can be used at all, I think the West and most countries now agree, because there's a whole proliferation, there's a whole market of drones, and countries are increasingly using them against their own citizens. So it is a robust tool for insurgencies and belligerent forces. And so in that sense, the world community is made of states, not non-state actors, and they dictate what international law is.
Very well. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us, but I think we got through quite a bit there, in fact, and we've learned a lot from these experts that we had on. We really appreciate Sikander, John, and Zahid for taking their time out of their busy schedules to join us today. We were discussing there mainly this letter that was written by around 113 organizations, global organizations, to Joe Biden, the new U.S. president, as I said in my introduction, asking him to end the use of drone strikes in non-combat zones. But then it's beyond that. As Zahid there correctly pointed out, it's not just, in fact, drones, but yes, drones are the easiest thing to point at because the collateral damage is so significant, and then there is this issue of disconnect, right? You are not on the ground fighting. You are completely disconnected from the realities of those people who you are affecting by using your joystick, sitting, several countries or nations or even continents away. And then there's a disconnect as well on the issue of racial injustice and racial justice, however we may want to term that, the fact that these are not people in developed countries that are being affected. And in fact, as Sikander also then pointed out, it's within these developing countries that is the lowliest of the low who are then affected, because it's obviously not the elite who are going to be affected even in the developing world. So it's the lowest of the low people, unfortunately, the innocents in the truest terms, that are being affected by these strikes. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Viewers, you're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss a topic that is increasingly becoming or being spoken more and more of, and that is the issue of critical race theory and why there is then this effort, on the part of some to ensure that that is spoken of, even within the education system towards students. In the United States, more specifically, in many of those countries that have had issues with race and colonialism, etc., as well as systemic racism. And then there is this effort to oppose it as well. Now, critical race theory in and of itself, and I will ask, of course, our guests to explain this further, and they probably will do a better job than I can, but just the basics of it, from what I've understood, is that the law and legal institutions, at least as insofar as we're talking about the U.S., are then seen as inherently racist because then they function to create and maintain specific social, economic, and political inequalities then between the quote-unquote white population as well as the non-whites, and more specifically then the African-American community when we're talking in the context of the United States. So let's discuss this a bit further then with our esteemed panelists who are joining us this morning. We're joined by Dr. Kevin McGruder, who is an associate professor of history at Antioch College. He is joining us from Yellow Springs, Ohio. And joining us from Storrs, Connecticut is Dr. Matthew Hughey, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut. Matthew and Kevin, thank you both for your time this morning. Kevin, let me start with you. If you can, just for those of us who are still fairly new to the issue of critical race theory, if you could just explain it to us, and why is this now becoming increasingly important to address?
Critical race theory was a way of looking at both American history and American institutions, and it really developed through legal scholars looking at the ways that the law has been used in the United States to solidify and reinforce racist ideas. And I would kind of describe how it describes the law a little bit differently than you did. And so it's not saying that all efforts of the law are racist, but that the law has been used to express racist ideas. And so during the colonial period, the law was used to ensure that slavery was slavery for life, or that the status of the child followed the status of the mother. The law did those things. Our Constitution, when it was written in 1787, incorporated elements that supported slavery. The word slavery is never used, but it gave protection to enslavers to be able to get their, quote, property if those freedom seekers went to another state. And even after slavery ended, a lot of those elements of the law were still there. And so what critical race theorists in the late 70s, early 80s were saying is, we need to look at the way our institutions incorporate this racist ideology. And why that is coming up now, I believe it's a backlash to what we've seen really probably in the last decade by scholars and activists to create an anti-racist society. And I would argue that Ibram X. Kendi, his book that came out in 2016, Stamped from the Beginning, a definitive history of racist ideas in America, really articulates that. And then he followed that with how to be an anti-racist. Anti-racists look at dismantling racism. Okay, and that
if I may just come in, Kevin, I will, of course, come back to you. I wanted to bring Matthew into the conversation as well. Matthew, I wanted to, of course, get your thoughts about what Kevin there said, and I appreciate, of course, Kevin's clarification. I did not mean to state that every single law, of course, in the U.S. is working towards racism or ensuring that there is that inequality that remains. But nevertheless, Matthew, do you think that the U.S. is ready now to finally be able to deal with the situation? Because, we've spoken many times, and I've spoken with many experts where we've always had this concept of the post-civil rights era, right? So now we're beyond that. And I would imagine in many Americans' minds, not all, of course, but in many Americans' minds, we're beyond this sort of stuff.
So I think the idea of a post-racial, if you will, America is seductive to a lot of people because it contains different elements of hope and optimism about the future. Unfortunately, I think what's happening, and this echoes some of what was just said, that critical race theory is being then used as a kind of boogeyman, as a scary ideology and practice that supposedly is being used to take us away from a post-racial version of the United States that some people think that we have already attained. And that belief itself relies on a lot of ignorance, whether that's willful ignorance or plain unknowing of the facts. The facts remain that the United States is still a deeply divided, deeply unequal, along the lines of race, nation. And critical race theory is simply one tool out of so many that exist out there to try to examine how, why, and in what ways that inequality has developed, how it continues, whether through the law, through our social institutions, through normative practices, what have you. But critical race theory, I think, is kind of being used in ways to scare people, especially to scare white constituents in the United States that don't know much about it, but think that it's somehow anti-white or is somehow besmirching or negatively framing the United States in ways that make white people look bad. Yeah. And a part of that story is true when we examine the history of the United States. Like, a lot of wrongs were done and continue to be done by the hands of white folks. But the point of critical race theory is not to demonize or to deify any particular group. It's to simply examine in what ways and with what effect race and racism continue to function.
Kevin, Matt, very good point. That's what I wanted to, in fact, ask you next, is that the backlash, if that's the correct term to use, against then the attempt to use critical race theory more within the education system and otherwise as well, to speak about it, has been the very thing that Matthew there described, that this is in some ways reverse racism against the white folk then, and then it's also then in some ways also staining then the history of the United States. I mean, and is going to make people feel less proud to be American, as some of the expert opinions that I've heard and spoken to. What are your thoughts on that?
That's not accurate. Critical race theory is not being taught in elementary schools, junior high schools, or high schools. It's often not even being taught in the undergraduate level. People may encounter it in graduate school, but what it is doing is challenging the dominant narrative of the history of the United States. There are some people who would like to believe that equality began from the beginning, that that's what the nation was committed to, and it wasn't. And they don't like that. And so they're using a broad brush to call anything that challenges that narrative as critical race theory. And it's not. Critical race, all these people, challenging school boards across the country, those schools are not teaching critical race theory. They may be teaching children to understand that we have a history of working toward liberty, but there's also a history of oppression. And there's nothing wrong with children understanding that, because that will help them understand the complicated world we live in now, and also understand why the rest of the world looks at us very critically when we challenge their human rights, when our human rights in our own country, we don't have a great record on that.
Matthew, if then we have then the proper history of racism taught in the United States, as well as the systemic realities that exist, right? If that is actually taught to students, and people actually then wake up to all of the realities, I'm speaking in a utopian sense right now, what then happens? What are we expecting to happen the next day? Is it about, are we heading towards a discussion of reparations? Obviously, reforms within the system is an obvious one, but beyond that, what then is the goal?
I mean, that's an interesting question, and I take issue a little bit with the framing of it, because I think that framing in and of itself kind of adopts a part of the agenda of those that are trying to attack critical race theory. Critical race theory, and as was laid out by you and my colleague here, are many different things. It's a way of looking at racism, not necessarily as permanent or endemic, but as normal and as systematic in the United States. It critiques this kind of liberal notion of colorblindness, that if we just ignore race, it will go away. It privileges storytelling from the margins, from especially people of color, women, other marginalized perspectives, right? So the point is simply knowledge and truth, as is supposed to be the point of primary schools, elementary schools, high schools, and colleges and universities. As was said earlier, critical race theory is not that big a field. It's fairly small and a minor part of legal studies and some social science perspectives, some humanities perspectives. But the point is that it should be a part of our toolkit, that we should be able to use these tools, these perspectives, these philosophies, and these methodologies to try to be able to understand our past and then our present, so that we can hopefully not repeat many of the mistakes that we've done in our future. So the point here is simply to try to learn and then to marshal that knowledge to be able to forge a better world, not based on the principles of white supremacy, of racial exclusion and anti-Blackness that we have used and continue to use in some ways. So I'd say that's the larger point, not to somehow demonize people. My colleague is right. Like, that's not what this is about. Rather, this should be about education. But the way it's being framed, I think, is being reframed as a political issue to score political points with a particular political party.
All right. So, Kevin, I wanted to, in fact, talk about the politics of this, right? So there is this framing that's already, it's already happened, right? On if I may be completely honest, on the Republican side, right? So there's this effort on their part to sort of stop this or block this in many states across the U.S. Will they succeed, A? And B, is it almost a sign, do you think, that this is something that they fear that is already being widely accepted and acknowledged? Is that what the real fear is? Is this almost growing pains for a society that is coming to terms with the reality of racism within its ranks?
I think it's being used by strategists as a tool for mobilizing their base, in the same way that the bathroom bills regarding transgender students was being used several years ago. There's now in different states bills against transgender athletes competing, even though if you look at all of those cases, there's really very few incidences that support them. And that's why I wanted to be clear, it would be the rare elementary school or high school that is teaching critical race theory. And so to say that this is in response to something that's actually happening is not accurate. I think it is a response to people who don't want to face the reality that we have a complex history of oppression and a corollary history of movement toward equality, that they just want to focus on the equality. And if you just focus on that, you can't understand why every few weeks Black people are being killed by the police. That's not just a mystery or an anomaly. You have to understand the anti-Blackness that is endemic in our history. And that's not indicting any individual white person, but it's saying we've created systems that incorporate anti-Blackness. And we can't dismantle those until we recognize that that exists.
All right, let me add another voice to the conversation, being joined now by Dr. Lewis Gordon, who is a professor and head of the philosophy department at the University of Connecticut. He's joining us this morning from West Hartford, Connecticut. Lewis, good morning to you, and thank you very much for taking your time out for us today here in Scope. I wanted to ask you, Lewis, we've spoken so far about critical race theory, and the entire narrative that is being built against it by those who do not want it to be spoken of, even really. And there's this idea that this is an attack on the white people, etc. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, please.
Oh, it's basically right-wing spin. There's a technique the right has been using since 2001, which is a technique of what's called lawfare, but it's also a technique that goes all the way back to Nazi Germany. And what it basically is to hammer home a false narrative in sufficient repetition that people will come to believe the false narrative, and as a consequence, will refuse to look at the truth. Most of what's being used by the right now, and in the United States, the right is predominantly a racist right. Its main goal is to use and present narratives that will construct white people as victims in American society. And what they will do is to construct a straw man or highly misrepresenting views of anybody who criticizes the history of the United States. The history of the United States has just not been a history of white people under attack. It's been a history that's been linked to colonialism, imperialism, racism, and in the cases of many of the indigenous people, genocide. That's just a fact. And it's not just the United States. There are many countries, but part of what the right is doing right now is to turn away from the realities of the Trump administration. It's just pretty obvious.
I wonder then, Louis, if I may stick with you for one more question before I move on to the other guests as well. I wonder then, what kind of a precedent does this, do you think, set for the other countries that are dealing with these issues as well, right? So we have, as you well know, just across the border in Canada, there's a huge issue right now of all those mass graves that are being found of Indigenous children as well. And of course, there is this still very much a huge issue about racism towards people of color there, certainly. But then it's worldwide in many ways, right? So what happens in America many times has these ripple effects across the world. What kind of a ripple effect do you think this sort of debate, quote unquote controversy, if that's the right term, will have?
Well, the thing about it is it's actually a drummed up controversy. And basically, I mean, it's similar to the whole controversy of the idea of a stolen election for Trump. I mean, the facts are there. And a lot of these issues are actually a war on facts. Yes, Canada's history is not only more egregious than many people would realize, but if we look at the history of a country like South Africa, or even we look at a country like Germany in World War II, many of them saw themselves as actually trying to use North American countries, and in fact, also Latin American countries, as models for what they wanted to implement in Europe and in Africa. So the ripple effect, of course, is what we're already seeing. We're seeing, for instance, in countries like France, where they're claiming there's no racism in France, there's no racism in the UK. These are all from the right or the neoliberal groups. When we look at the actual history, if you look at the history, for instance, of a lot of the construction of race and racism, France and the French Empire played an important and huge role in that history. But here's the basic point. The basic point is that there is a confusion between what's called critical legal studies and critical race studies, and the very idea that young people are not able to handle knowing their actual history is highly problematic. Indeed. The fact of the matter is, Black children grow up actually knowing the history very well. It would be weird to tell Black children in the United States, for instance, that there's never been a history of police violence. That means that history would be undermining its credibility because it will be teaching falsehoods. Yeah. And what this effort is a project of trying to force not only on the Canadian, the U.S., and children in many other countries, falsehoods, but it's also on that falsehood actually to create foundations for ongoing perpetuation of lies.
Right. Okay, unfortunately, the clock got the best of us, but I will have to leave it there. That is the final word. But we really, really appreciate Louis, Matthew, and Kevin for taking their time out early this morning at their end to speak to us and to share their expertise with us. We're discussing their critical race theory, and I am in no way, shape, or form an expert on the issue, and I appreciate the clarifications that each of our panelists will be able to bring to this situation. And that, again, then goes to show, I think, especially for the rest of us on the outside of the situation, the ignorance that we have about this, A, and B, the clarifications that are very much needed, because it seems that this is being hijacked by the other side, and there's a very specific narrative that is being then designed and outlined, i.e. that this is an attack on white people, that this is an attack on, the United States in some fashion. Why is speaking about what is actually history an attack on anybody? It's just talking about facts, A. And why is talking about systemic issues, partly, of course, and I know that's not the entire issue at play here. Why would that be problematic for any child, especially white children, is also to then learn as fact, because it is fact. So we'll keep a close eye on, of course, this controversy, as I called it, and debate in the days coming, and as well as the months. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.